Hi, my name is Tyina Steptoe. I'm a cultural historian at University of Arizona, and I'm a DJ on 91.3 FM, KXCI Tucson. I host the show Soul Stories, which explores the roots and branches of rhythm and blues music. And today I am so excited to be in conversation with Arizona artist and dancer, musician, all-around creative person, Chezale, about her new project, Dear Ancestors. And thank you so much for inviting me to be in conversation with you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Tyina, for having me. It's a joy to be here.
Thank you. Now, as someone who studies history, I was immediately interested in the title, Dear Ancestors, before I even heard a word of it.
Yes.
So will you tell me about some of the inspiration for this project?
Oh my goodness. Well, I would say this song, the lyrics, the melodies, just this expression came to me a few years ago. I actually had to go and look up my voice notes to see when that started, because that kind of helps me track. It'll come to me before I write anything down or structure the song. And that's how I was able to sort of timestamp when I did this. And I couldn't believe that it was like January of 2020. I'm like, wow, there was probably a lot going on at that time that sort of inspired this. But for me, I think I've always wanted to do some sort of tribute to those who came before me. I've always felt a deep sense of reverence for those people, especially within my community. And I realized that I hadn't quite yet done a song in this way. So I felt like it was time for me to really do this dedication to my ancestors, whether it be direct ancestry to my bloodline or just the ancestors of my community and beyond who have transitioned to the next realm.
Listening to the song, I can hear different layers of the way that you're dealing with ancestry, right?
Yeah.
There's the lyrics, of course. And then also there are the other musical elements. Will you tell me about how that came together? How does ancestry sound for you?
Oh my goodness. Well, I would say normally my songwriting process starts with the track that I hear first. It's usually been that way. And so I had these series of tracks that I had. Shout out to the producer, Michael Custom Polk, who actually produced this track. And it stood out to me so much, and it felt so powerful. And immediately I was just taken by the layers of sound, as you mentioned, that were in it. There's some vocal samples in there as well. And I felt this really sort of tribal feeling as well when I hear the song, and I'm like, oh my goodness. So I knew that lyrically I had to come with something strong that was in alignment with that. But yeah, it just stood out to me in those ways. You hear calls in the background, and it just took me to a place. It took me to the motherland. It took me all around and, the world and back. The way it inspired my pen was just to say, okay, I really have to do something here that is special to my community. I want to come up with a message, not so much a traditional song structure with a hook and everyone's kind of singing along. It wasn't really that approach this time. More so it was just really I just had to come with these unapologetic verses that that came out at that time, and it wasn't really a hook, but then these bridges kind of came out of nowhere as well. So I was inspired by Negro spirituals, with this as well. It took me to so many different places. It's interesting speaking about it, outer body right now, but I wanted to find a way to uplift, to acknowledge and to give them voice, to let them know that they're not forgotten about, their work and their sacrifice and contribution. I wanted it to be a form of praise, and also to be unapologetic about that in my delivery. So that's sort of the space I was in when I created it.
I love hearing you talk about that. And, you said something in there that reminded me of the idea of call and response.
Yes.
Right? That I can hear in your work in a musical sense, but also even beyond that,
Yeah.
right? Thinking about, with call and response, I think it creates a circle. Right, that's how when I think of call and response, I think of circles instead of something that's linear,
Yeah.
or someone listening and just absorbing while someone else says something. Call and response is
Yes.
about bridges and communities, circles for me,
Wow.
and I could hear so much of that
Oh.
when I listened to Dear Ancestors. So that jumped out when you said calls.
I love that you said that, because when you make the reference to the circles, I immediately think of the cipher.
Yes.
Right? Which has so many different meanings, but in particular with me and how I was introduced to the cipher was within hip hop, right? And that's something that is really central to hip hop culture, is the cipher. And when we speak of a cipher, whenever I've been teaching classes, the way I describe it to my students is the cipher essentially is an exchange of energy. It's sort of this circular, right, exchange of energy, and it actually literally a lot of times takes circular form. So a cipher can be where you have a group of people standing around, right? And it could be a dance cipher where someone enters the center of that circle and they're freestyling, or it could be a rap cipher, right? But the whole idea is that there's this exchange of energy. So you may have an MC, or a poet or whatever delivering there, but then you also have this energy around that circle of people just kind of, cheering them on or listening. But it's highly infectious and contagious, this cipher. So it means a lot to hear you say that. And also call and response is very relevant to hip hop culture as well. I think of its origins, right? I think of Cab Calloway, is one of the earliest examples that I remember with call and response. The hidey, hidey, hidey,
Exactly.
hi, right? Odi, 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 right? And there's so many connections there. So to hear you say that with this is I didn't go into it with that thought at all. But there's so many cultural connections to that, right? With the song on Wax. And also when you're live and you have people in your space, how are we connecting?
Right.
And that's one of the ways that that we connect in music. And again, I reference hip hop as well. And I didn't go into this saying this is a hip hop song. That was just the delivery. When you hear the drive of the bass and you hear the drum and you hear the rhythm, is okay, I have to speak to this in a powerful rhythmic fashion that shows itself a lot of the time in hip hop music.
I'm so glad you brought that up because it was something I wanted to ask you about. One of the things that really strikes me about your music, when I see that there's a new Chezale song, I wonder, is she going to be singing? Is she going to be rapping on this? Is it going to be a combination of both?
Yep.
Because you bring such diverse forms of musicality to your music. It's always distinctively you, right? It's always you. But I'm always interested in what mode you're going to be in. And I'm thinking this past summer, I played Pink of Monsoon.
Oh, yes.
Many times. I actually built a show around, I decided I'm going to do a monsoon show.
Really?
When that single dropped. So I was like, oh, well, you're singing on that. It's a Quiet Storm kind of vibe going on there. And then I heard Dear Ancestors and thought, I'm not sure which one she's going to be doing here. So it's so fascinating to hear how, certain things, the rhythms spoke to you and made you think this is more hip hop in this case.
I love that thank you for that. I love that you bring that up because that has been the foundation of my musical expression from the beginning. However I'm inspired in that moment, it might be just singing. It might only be that. It might be I just gotta drop some bars on this, and it might be a combination, and I'm so glad that you and other folks who have been following my music and listening to it have picked up that that mood can change, right? That I can bring a different element to it, and it's not always intentional. It really comes from a core place where I feel, okay, this is how this is gonna come out, and this is, you just gotta let it go. This is what it is, you know? And yeah, so for this, in order for me to capture that powerful delivery, it's driven by that rap style or that orator style, but also in those bridges is where I wanted to bring a contrast of the Negro spiritual and bring that sort of vocal to it as well. But I like to say and I like to think and feel that the ancestors and the spirit of the ancestors were coming through me when I was delivering that.
I think that's part of the power of bringing back these kind of centuries old styles in certain ways, because they do still have so much resonance.
Absolutely.
You know, a lot of the people who were early jazz performers, or even before that, ragtime, they were also thinking about spirituals.
Yes.
When they were making their music. People like James Reese Europe, I'm sure Cap Calloway even too.
Yes.
So that as an ancestral kind of place that roots us,
yes,
sonically and in terms of our history, politically even.
Yes.
I think that it's something that we keep coming back to regardless of the form, the modern form that it winds up taking. So much I think can be traced to
Absolutely.
Spirituals, and I love the idea that you wanted the ancestors to speak, you
Yes.
know, by drawing on that
Absolutely.
older form.
Absolutely. I think it's interesting that you say that. I think that thread is very prevalent in Black music. It's in our DNA, even when we don't realize it.
Right.
And you hear these sounds and you hear gospel music and you hear all of these things, and you realize that there is this common thread and connection. And again, this track just influenced that with me. And I would say also it took me to an emotional place, and it still does, even to hear it now, you know, from its conception a few years ago and then to hear it in its completion now. Sometimes it hits you, you know, and you feel whatever that spiritual feeling is, it just comes through, especially I feel when the intention is there and the intention is pure. That's why I like to think of it as a call or a mantra or a prayer, even in my delivery of this song.
I can certainly hear that, and I'm
Yeah.
glad you unpacked that for us. You know, I think that there are some days that, for me, I wake up in the morning and I want to hear Mahalia Jackson, you know? And I know that for me goes back to my grandmother, who she used to play Mahalia in the morning.
My
and
grandmother
sing.
loves her too.
Right, so
Yes.
it connects me to my grandmother, but then her roots
Yes.
as well, you know?
Yes.
And this all reminds me a little of that idea of the changing sane. It's what the culture critic Greg Tate named it, but there have been all sorts of other ways that people have tried to conceptualize those links to ancestry.
Yes.
There's a writer named Craig Warner who called it the jazz impulse.
Oh, wow.
Right, there's this idea that in jazz, there's always a looking back to move forward.
Yes.
And Tate himself said you can be forward thinking and backward thinking at the same time.
Absolutely.
You know, and I keep thinking of that when I hear Dear Ancestors and then our conversation today.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how do you see that playing out in your work?
Wow. Changing time. I would say the first thing that comes to mind when I think of that is it's almost impossible to move forward without looking back or acknowledging the back or acknowledging the past. I'm someone who does not believe in dismissal of the past or brushing it under the rug. I would not be where I am and who I am without the past, right? And those who came before me. So I can understand how that concept is simultaneous, you know, and that you can, two can exist at the same time. you know? And I also, one of the things I love from Nina Simone, where she said that an artist should reflect the times as well, right? So reflecting the present time, but without that, you can't necessarily do that without also acknowledging the previous time as well, so that we can find ways to process that so that we can move forward in a healthy manner.
Right.
Yeah, so the changing same, I am for that, and I think more people should sort of wrap their minds around that concept as well.
Right, and I can't help but notice your earrings here. They are so lovely, and I see Afro-Rican pride, right? Is that tapping into your personal roots?
It does. These were actually gifted to me from my mom. She's like, I gotta get these for Chezale. It's interesting that you bring that up. Yeah, I probably was like, well, these were just cute with my outfit, so I just put them on. But yes, it does. It's very direct. To my roots on my dad's side of the family. We do share Puerto Rican ancestry as well. So the generation of my paternal grandfather and his siblings and his parents came from Puerto Rico. So that's where that comes from. Anytime you hear me speak to Boricua pride or shout out to Puerto Rico. And that was also that's also a very interesting part of my existence and upbringing as well. But, I always say, even with that, my identity, my walk, both of my parents is that of a Black woman. So that is always at the forefront for me.
So we're talking about diaspora, how that especially connects with your own heritage, sense of ancestry. And I'm actually wondering about you as someone who lives in Arizona. I think you said you've lived here since 96.
Yeah.
Or so, right. So you've been here for a while now.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, how does life in Arizona influence your art, your ideas about music, and even connecting to the notion of ancestry?
Yeah, wow, that's a great question, because now I've lived in Arizona the majority of my life, in Tucson, Arizona, to be specific. And I feel, living in Tucson and the Southwest, it has its own vibe, its own personality, its own culture, right? So for me, in my journey here, I'm a native to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So Northeast, which is a lot different, as you can imagine. And so my grandmother and her husband at the time, they moved here in the early 90s. And so we would go back and forth sometimes in the early 90s. And then we ended up making it a more permanent home in 96. But the good part is then I already had some familiarity with it here, because I would even split the school years as well.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I had already had former classmates and things like that. So it was very interesting of an upbringing for me, going back and forth with how many miles apart are we across the states, different climate, different everything. I would say it was a culture shock, definitely. I would say in Pennsylvania, the cultural makeup or the racial makeup there was predominantly what I was used to was black and white. That was it, And it was interesting growing up because I have a Latino Spanish last name, Rodriguez. And so that sometimes confused people with how I present physically, right? So even in Pittsburgh, sometimes I would get, from a couple of, I went to predominantly black schools, and it'd be like, why is that your last name? Or like, and then I'd come here and get even more of that reaction, and I knew that there was something different there, I didn't think of it that strongly. I was like, this is just my name, But coming here, then it was like, oh, I met a lot of other Rodriguez's and things too. So yeah, I had moments where I wasn't always welcomed, where I did encounter racism too. Even in Pennsylvania, I had as well from my white students, and then coming here, I encountered it from both white and Mexican. That's been my journey over time, is it taking folks wanting to get to know me and asking questions like, what is your racial makeup? Oh, Puerto Rican, that's not even really heard of out here. You know what I mean? So it's like, oh, there's another Latino group too? Oh, wow. So that has been interesting growing up in Arizona, but everything, right? Not just culturally, just, the landscape, the food, the traditions. I feel like that has really made my experience different than other, let's say, family back east, especially the area that I grew up on is the southwest part of Tucson as well, where the makeup was also Chicano and indigenous as well. So being able to have those teachings and learnings early on, and me having also a desire to learn Spanish too, even though I wish I'm still not fluent, but and my Spanglish is strong. But I had that desire. Like, I taught myself how to count, I taught myself colors, I taught myself all of that stuff before taking classes. So all of these experiences have shaped, I would say, my experience, as a Black woman, and or Afro-Latina as well. So yeah, I would say Arizona is a very special and unique experience and vibe here. And now I feel like I can educate others, right, on Tucson and what it is. And man, Tucson has its own thing. Like, nobody could really down talk it too much to me. Like, you know what I mean? I'm like, come on now, what you know about this? Like, like in Peak of Monsoon, I make a lot of references about that too. Like, when I say Big Cat, Little Cat Mountain, a lot of people might not know that if they didn't grow up over near Valencia or like those areas. And, I make the reference of like smelling creosote in the air, literally riding the Amtrak train from Pittsburgh 3 days coming here.
Wow.
And as a kid getting off the train and smelling that air after fresh rain, that scent to me is like, I'll never forget it, So it has definitely had its impact on me.
I can totally understand that. I've only lived here since 2014.
Okay.
And it's already
right, you already feel it.
You feel it.
Yep.
It's true. Sensory wise, as you said, this place can feel magical.
Oh my gosh.
And that actually leads me to the visuals.
Okay.
For this project. How did you decide on where? I thought it was so powerful that the video opens and you see the American flag against the backdrop of the desert.
Yeah. Wow. How did that come together? Yeah. So I think the desert came into place because in the song I reference like the Serengeti as well, right? And the Saharan deserts, the African deserts too. So I'm like, hello, we're in the land of the desert. So it only makes sense for me to be out here. I wanted that sense of nature, that there's something so special about the Saguaro Desert here in Arizona. If anyone has ever had the opportunity to just be out there and to go on those hikes and to walk those trails and to see the saguaro like stand tall and strong, and if you learn about it, it's like they've been here for years and years and years. So even for me, growing up on the East Coast, I love trees because I was engulfed in that.
Right.
So then coming here, I also have a different respect for the saguaro when I'm around it. And so in the vision for the video, it was only appropriate for me to be in the middle of the desert and to adorn the American flag as well, because I also want to highlight and tell and show the story of the beginnings of Black folk coming here, right? And how I know there's a lot of conflicted feelings, right, about this flag and this country and what it represents. But I think now with what we're learning, right, more about the culture, and just recently the 1619 project just dropped. I can't wait to get into that on Hulu. Is that I want to also encourage folks that there can be a sense of pride as well, because our ancestors endured a lot,
Right.
and have had a lot on their back in regards to their labor in this country. And so it's not to be shunned. And if I'm correct me if I'm wrong, I remember doing research that it was a Black woman who even stitched that flag and put it together. Mm-hmm. So that's why I wanted that imagery to open the video.
Right. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm thinking about, you mentioned Nina Simone earlier, mm-hmm. and how modern politics were so frequently part of her music, even as, right, she's looking back and bringing in ancestral sounds. And I'm really wondering about how modern events, even going back a few years, have shaped you as an artist.
It's interesting that this came together a few years ago. I feel like a lot of creativity came out of me during 2020, and I'm sure a lot of other folk as well. But in my own experience, you know, it's hard to talk about, 2020 without mention of the pandemic and where we were mentally and spiritually and physically and emotionally during that time. And I remember having a lot of time to myself, like a lot of time, right. during quarantine, and a height of social unrest in the country during that time. And seeing just Black bodies being discarded left and right, and it being in our face, you know. You can't even scroll social media, you know, without, boom, someone's life is being snuffed out right before us. So just all of that, you know, that we're going through. For me, I got to a point, I was even releasing a song of mine at the time, Special Friend, and a video and everything. But I would say by about the summer, by like June, I was feeling heavy, very heavy as a person and as an artist. And I felt like I needed to have some sort of, I was itching for a release, basically. And I was itching to give voice to the voiceless, right? After George Floyd and after Breonna Taylor and Elijah McClain and Ahmaud Arbery and on and on and on. And mind you, we had 2016, we had 2014, the Trayvon Martin, we had Eric Garner, just the list goes on. So at this point, I remember feeling like I said, okay, I gotta go somewhere. In this case, it was to a studio. Shout out to Movement Culture, that's the studio I went to. And I said, I just gotta do something and let it out. I don't know what it is, I don't know. And I wanna do this in the form of dance, and I wanna do this in some sort of song form. And I came up with a piece called Amplify Me. And at that time, there was a lot of language and hashtag around like amplifying Black voices, amplifying, you know, artists and just all of this. And so that's what came to me. And it's so interesting because I want to say the morning I went to the studio, or the morning before that even, is when those words came to me in my kitchen. And I planned on doing something else. But this, and that's what I mean about the ancestors, and that's what I mean about the voiceless. I feel a strong sense of them and their spirit coming through. Anytime it just happens like that, at that point it's not just me anymore. Right. It's not just me. It's greater, right? Mm-hmm. And so that time frame in a great way influenced me as an artist. And even now, probably from here on out, how I approach my music. Because I make music for everything, really, for a lot of moods and things like that. But I do feel like it's important to have something that represents something greater and something that's not always light.
You know, one thing that I mentioned at the very beginning when I introduced you is that you are a multifaceted artist. And even now, you're working in an art center, you do educating, and you're a dancer, right? And I wonder how movement informs your work? You know, when you're thinking about music and lyrics, are you thinking about movement yet? When does that come into the process?
I would say it comes into the process, and it depends on the music itself and how that drives me and influences me, the rhythms. That is such an integral part of my makeup and who I am from the beginning. Like, if you ask family, I've been dancing since yay high, you know? And so anytime I hear rhythms and music, it's just, you know, and not all music, but some of it really gets in there, right? And so, for example, with Dear Ancestors, there is movement that is a part of that visual, and that also stemmed from me wanting to honor the ancestors who translated their expression through movement. Right? Across the spectrum, the creative spectrum. But specifically with this, I was inspired by Alvin Ailey.
Okay.
And the Alvin Ailey dancers. And their, their infamous pieces. There's about 2 that really inspired that sort of motion. And that comes from the drum. That comes from the combination and layers of this musicality and the voice and the calls, and it just only made sense. I said, I want to represent that, even back to plantation dances, right? The earliest of Black American dances and the slaves and what they had to endure on and off the ships. Dance in many ways was a saving grace, a form of celebration.
Right.
But in other ways, it was used as a form of punishment. It was used as a form of exercise so that they can deliver this work.
Right.
So I have a lot of emotions, right, about that. So it comes from all of these places, specifically with that piece. But if it's another piece that has that bounce, you know what I'm saying? You might bounce a little something, you might twerk a little something. It's okay. I think it's a part of our culture in so many different ways. Movement, right? And even twerking gets a bad rep when it shouldn't, when we speak about the root of it and where it comes from. And it's very African, right? And so on. I can go on and on. But the movement is always there. Or usually.
Right. I think that's so true. So much of the music that we've talked about today has some sort of dance component.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that when we consume one part of it, sometimes we don't know how people were dancing to it if we don't have the visual representation in the archive for us. So sometimes with it, I do like to imagine, how were people dancing to this back then? Because it can change the way that I engage with it as a form. If you think this isn't music people would have been sitting and listening to, this is music that they would have moved to as well. And, you know, as you were talking about with our enslaved ancestors, that movement, when you have so much of your body is controlled by someone, to then be able to move in your own way, in a way that speaks to your own heritage, to the community that you're in. You know, the power of that. I think that's something that then later descendants held on to.
Absolutely. And with everything, there's evolution, right? Even with movement. And there's also that cycle, like when you spoke about the changing same, right? It's the same idea, is a lot of our movements are connected, right? From back then, when you learn about them, you know, I do that a lot in my teachings, you know, from the twist, you know, Chubby Checkers, the twist, on down to the Pool Palace from Atlanta. You know what I mean? There's always these connections. So I always say, do your research. History is important.
Yes, I love the way that people can do historical work with body movement.
Yes.
Right? That this is a kind of living archive then of the Black experience, right? The way that bodies move, the continuity, and then some of the remixes, right?
Absolutely.
That come into it,
Absolutely.
right? That's a beautiful idea.
Yes.
Is there anything else that you think is important that you want to convey about this project?
I just really encourage folks to listen with open ears, open mind, open heart, and it may even inspire them with their own ancestry as well. I hope that it bridges those gaps for folks. Also with this, speaking a lot to specifically Black American ancestry, I really want folks to do their research on reparations and what that means for Black folk, especially descendants of U.S. chattel slavery. I think that's very important, and I stand by that. There's a lot of restorative justice that needs to happen, economic justice, and so many of our great leaders spoke to that, like Dr. Martin Luther King, and we need to prioritize those things. So that's one of the things that I would like folks to walk away with, and to remain inspired in the creation of their expression and their art, because it's not easy these days to be vulnerable and to put your work out there. But I inspire those who are thinking of it to just do it and be you, and you never know who that's going to resonate with.
Right. And thank you so much for putting yourself out there.
Thank you.
And giving us more music.
Thank you. I'm honored to.
Thank you. Yes. It's been a pleasure and an honor to talk to you today, to get to know more about your roots, your inspiration, and this new project. This is the artist Chezale presenting her new work, Dear Ancestors. I'm Tyina Steptoe. It has been a pleasure to have this conversation. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Tyina.
Thank you. And now, with the performance of her new song, Dear Ancestors, here's Chezale.
This is for my ancestors. Whenever I feel alone, I feel them moving all around me. For my warriors. For my goddesses. For my protectors. Ashe. You can never take my culture, cause we poach them kind of vultures. I got eyes in the back of my head, so I never have to look over my shoulder. I'm trying to be my ancestors' wildest dreams, experiencing things that they never seen. They paved the way for my freedom, forever indebted. I know they're proud of this young Black queen, I could never joke about it, walk them out in their shoes, but is you really about it? Could you live the life they lived? I really doubt it. Ignorance is bliss and it's getting kinda crowded. This is for my Harriets, this is for Asada, this is for Amina, Ania Esante. I thank you for courage, thank you for fight, thank you for freedom, thank you for light. Unrest in my spirit, resilience in my soul, a story in my eyes as I watch my life unfold. Watch my life unfold, fold. See, it gets specific with my lineage. Our story's unique, and you can't tell me any different. Take a people from their land because they're brilliant, and never give them credit for the country that they building. But we waking up though, some sleep they KO'd. Everybody can come, they get left behind on that railroad. Vision clear, no rear, in my view, just bosses. No time for flossing. So many things we gotta make up for the lost time that costed. Sanity, wealth, trauma, fathers, sisters, brothers, cousins, daughters, mamas. Tried to cut the tree down, but them roots is unbothered. No, we bothered. When I feel lost, man, I channel y'all. If I gotta throw up them piles, man, I channel y'all. When I'm at peace, I channel you. I meditate and I breathe. My ancestor play a drum. When you hear it, know that's where it came from. I'm a lion, queen and my son. From the Serengeti to the mountain. Woo! My ancestor play a drum. When you hear it, know that's where it came from. I'm a lion, queen and my sun. From the Serengeti to the mountain. I mean, we all trying to heal. On this planetary realm, you know that ish get real, mass destruction. But spirit can never be killed. We gotta stay connected and fulfill our destiny. Not being afraid to ask the questions. Am I moving with the best in me, investing in me? I know my ancestors invested in me. And if I wild out, don't ever question me. Yo, I gotta speak to my folk. They be sending me the messages and symbols and notes. Life lessons, telling me to stop stressing. Work smarter, not harder. Manifest blessings. Gratitude in everything that you do. Keep creating just to reflect the creator in you. And while you're navigating, remember patience. And never let up on them reparations.